Welcome to online CET class. So today we are going to discuss synopsis of the chapter Dual Nature of Radiation and Matter. So the very first concept that we come across in this chapter is electron emission. So electron emission is the process of liberation of electrons from a metal surface. So we consider the emission from metallic surface because in case of metals there will be free electrons, so they are easy to remove. Now depending on by what means you remove the electron emission can be classified into four basic categories. First one is thermionic emission, second one is photoelectric emission, third one is field emission, fourth one is secondary emission. So thermionic emission is the process in which the energy to remove the electron from the metal surface is supplied by means of thermal means, that is by supply of heat energy. So this kind of thermionic emission takes place in vacuum devices like vacuum diode, vacuum triode and all. So it is used in vacuum devices. Then photoelectric emission, here the energy for electron is supplied by means of light. So light energy is used to eject the electron from the metal surface. Then in case of field emission, very high electric field is applied to the metal surface so that electrons are ripped off from the surface. So this is used in spark plugs and all. Then secondary emission, so electrons emitted by any one of these means is made to fall on the metal surface, so that will transfer energy and remove the electron from the metal surface. So this is used in what we call it as photomultiplier tube. It is used in photomultiplier tube. And metals are preferred for electron emission since they have large number of free electrons. So this is about electron emission. So now moving on to the next concept, that is quantum theory of radiation. So it was proposed by Max Planck in 1900 in order to explain the energy distribution in black body spectrum. So let us see what are the things in quantum theory of radiation. So according to Planck's quantum theory, the exchange of energy between matter and radiation takes place in discrete bundles of small energy, discrete packets of small energy, and these energy packets were termed as photon. So any absorption or emission process will not happen continuously, so it will happen in terms of discrete packets of energy. So that is what is the basis of the quantum theory of radiation. So coming to properties of these photons, so energy associated with each photon is given by E is equal to h nu. Remember, this is with one photon, where nu is frequency of the radiation and h is Planck's constant. Its value is 6.625 into 10 to the power minus 34 joule second. Then these photons propagate like particles with the speed of light. So that is, in vacuum they travel at the speed 3 into 10 to the power 8 meter per second. Rest mass of photon is 0 and photons are never found at rest. So in motion, the moving mass of photon is given by h nu by c square. This is obtained by equating the Einstein's mass energy relation mc square with Planck's relation h nu. So E is equal to h nu, E is equal to mc square. If you solve for m, you will get h nu by c square. Momentum associated with photon should be m into c. Send this c to other side, you will get h nu by c. That will give you momentum of photon. So nu by c can be written as 1 by lambda. So that is h by lambda, where lambda is wavelength of the radiation that we have used. When photon interacts with material particles, both energy and momentum are conserved, but number of photons is not conserved. So remember this, number of photons is not conserved. That means in any process a single photon may give rise to two photons of smaller energies, or number of small energy photons may combine to form one larger photon. So that is allowed. Then photons are electrically neutral and they do not ionize. If they are allowed to pass through some medium, they will not cause any ionization. So they cannot be deflected by electric and magnetic field. Then if you consider the power of a bulb, then power will be equal to energy per unit time. So energy is, if n photons are emitted per time t, then n into E divided by T, where E is energy of each photon. E is equal to h nu. So this can be used for some calculation purposes. The relation between energy in electron volt and wavelength is 12420 divided by lambda in angstrom, or you can take 1242 divided by lambda in nanometer. So this will directly give you energy of photon in electron volt. This can be used as a shortcut. Next, coming to photoelectric effect. So Einstein's photoelectric equation says h nu is equal to h nu naught plus half mv maximum square, where h nu is energy associated with incident photon, h nu naught is the work function of the metal surface, and v maximum is maximum velocity of photoelectron, then half v maximum square is maximum kinetic energy of photoelectron. So according to this equation, energy that is supplied by photon will be utilized to remove the electron from the metal surface. Remaining energy will appear as the kinetic energy of the electron. Now coming to laws of photoelectric effect. So the first observation here is photoelectric effect is instantaneous. There is no time delay between incidence of photon and the emission of electron from the metal surface. Time gap is of the order of 10 to the power minus 10 seconds or even less than this. So that's why you can take it as instantaneous. Then the strength of photoelectric current is proportional to intensity of incident radiation. If photocurrent generated in the tube is small letter I, this is directly proportional to intensity of radiation, capital letter I. So the photocurrent is independent of frequency. Then kinetic energy of photoelectrons increases with increase in frequency of incident radiation, but it is independent of intensity. Then stopping potential is proportional to frequency of incident radiation. Then for every photosensitive surface, there is a certain minimum frequency of incident radiation below which there is no photo emission takes place. So this is what we call it as threshold frequency. This is what we call it as threshold frequency. Then energy equivalent of stopping potential is nothing but maximum kinetic energy of emitted photoelectron. So if V naught is the stopping potential, E into V naught will be equal to half mv square. So that will give you maximum kinetic energy of photoelectron. Then the graph of kinetic energy versus frequency will be straight line. Slope of this straight line gives you Planck's constant h. X-intercept gives you the threshold frequency, and the negative intercept on the y-axis that gives you work function of the metal. So you'll get the graph like this: kinetic energy against frequency. You'll get a straight line. Slope will give you Planck's constant. The x-intercept, this much, will give you the threshold frequency nu naught, and y-intercept, this much, will give you work function of the metal. Next, coming to application of this photoelectric effect. So photocell is a device which converts radiation energy into electrical energy. So there are three types of photocells. One is photoemissive cell, photovoltaic cell, and photoconductive cell. Yes, with that we'll move to next concept, that is dual nature of radiation and matter. So far what we have seen is dual nature of radiation. Now we will come to dual nature of matter. So the concept of matter waves was introduced by Louis de Broglie. So matter waves are the waves which are associated with material particles in motion. Any moving particle is associated with a wave. That wave we call it as matter wave. So the wavelength of the wave associated with the particle in motion is given by lambda is equal to h by mv, where m is mass of the particle and v is velocity of the particle. Or you can write it as lambda is equal to h by p, where p is momentum of the particle. Then suppose if you have a particle having kinetic energy E, so by using momentum kinetic energy relation, we know that P is equal to mv, K is equal to half mv square. So I can write K is equal to P square by 2m. So P can be written as root of 2m. Here they have given kinetic energy as E, so let us take it as E. So it will be root of 2me. So substituting for P, we will get this h by root of 2me gives you lambda. Next, de Broglie wavelength of an electron accelerated through a potential difference of v volt is given by h divided by root of 2m ev. See, E into V will give you kinetic energy. Charge into potential difference will give you kinetic energy. Now h, mass of electron, E, charge on electron, all these things are universal constants. Substituting those values, keeping V as it is, we will get this equation 12.27 divided by root V angstrom. So this can be used as shortcut for solving problems. Now de Broglie wavelength depends on mass and speed of the moving particle. Then it is independent of charge and nature of the particle. Whether the body is charged or not, it is immaterial. It depends only on the mass and velocity of the particle. The de Broglie effects are not observable in the case of macroscopic object because their wavelength will be very small, of the order of 10 to the power minus 30 meter or even less than this. So there is no mechanism in which you can detect these waves. Then coming to Davis-Germer experiment. So Davis-Germer experiment was conducted in order to verify the de Broglie's hypothesis of matter waves. So this provided the experimental proof for wave nature of matter. Matter also is associated with wave, that was proved by Davis-Germer experiment. So the principle behind the experiment is the high energy electrons behave like wave. Their wavelength is given by lambda is equal to h divided by, not n, this should be h divided by root 2 mev. So using this, it was experimentally proved that matter behaves like wave. So there is wave nature for electron. So that is all about dual nature of radiation and matter. Thank you. Welcome to online CET class. So today we will discuss the synopsis of chapter atoms. So the first thing that we come across here is atomic models. So there were several atomic models were proposed. So following the discovery of electron by J.J. Thomson, the first atomic model was proposed by J.J. Thomson. So it failed to explain the origin of spectrum of the atom. Then it was Rutherford who discovered the proton. So Rutherford gave his atomic model. Then in 1932, Chadwick discovered neutron. So first ever nuclear atomic model was proposed by Rutherford even before the discovery of neutron. So these were the progresses in the theory of atoms. Rutherford, using his alpha scattering experiment, he explained the results of alpha scattering experiment by assuming that the entire positive charge of the atom is concentrated at the center of the atom, and that region he called it as nucleus of the atom. So nucleus contains all the positive charge of the atom and about 99.9% of the mass of the atom. So Rutherford's theory failed to explain stability of the atom. That's why it was Niels Bohr in 1913 introduced the atomic model. So it is called Bohr's atom model. So in Bohr's atomic model, you can explain the behavior of hydrogen atom and hydrogen like atom. The first successful atomic model which could explain the origin of spectrum was Bohr's model. So according to Bohr's theory, there was a condition, what we call it as Bohr's quantum condition. So angular momentum of the revolving electron should be integral multiple of h by 2 pi. So that is mvr is equal to nh by 2 pi, where n is the orbit number, or what we call it as principal quantum number. So it is called Bohr's quantum condition. Angular momentum of the electron is quantized. Only those orbits are possible which satisfy this particular condition. This was the first postulate of Bohr's theory. Then whenever electron makes a transition from one energy level to another energy level, the difference in energies E2 minus E1 will appear as electromagnetic radiation. So energy associated with electromagnetic radiation is given by h nu. So each electron transition results in one photon. A photon is emitted. Here if n2 is greater than n1, that means E2 is higher than E1. So energy is emitted. So this was used to explain the origin of spectrum. Then the condition for a mechanical stability of the electron is the centripetal force for revolving electron should be provided by the electrostatic force of attraction between the electron and the nucleus. So 1 by 4 pi epsilon naught is d square by r square. This is electrostatic force between nucleus and the electron, whereas mv square by r is centripetal force. So these two must be equal. That gives you mechanical stability. Then expression for radius of nth orbit of electron in hydrogen atom is given by Rn is equal to n square h square epsilon naught pi m e square. If it is other than hydrogen, there will be z in the denominator. It will be pi m z e square. So for the first orbit, n is equal to 1. If you substitute the values here, all are universal constants. So you'll get r is equal to 0.53 angstrom. That is called Bohr's radius. So radius of nth orbit is n square times the Bohr's radius. So r is proportional to n square. That is what you can notice. Then coming to velocity, expression for velocity of the electron in hydrogen atom. So velocity is given by e square divided by 2nh epsilon naught. In case of hydrogen like atom, it will be z square by 2nh epsilon naught. So if you put n is equal to 1 for hydrogen atom, you will get it to be 2.19 into 10 to the power 6 meter per second. So this is about 1 by 137 times the velocity of light in vacuum. So this is what you get. So C by 137 will give you, this n is not here, C by 137 will give you the velocity. Then velocity is inversely proportional to square root of radius So that can be proved. Yes. Proceeding further, expression for energy of the electron in hydrogen atom. So in hydrogen atom, it will be me to the power 4 divided by 8 epsilon naught n square h square. This is total energy. Suppose if it is other than hydrogen atom, there will be z square term in the numerator, mz square e to the power 4. And notice one thing, total energy is negative. That means negative energy says that electron is bound to the system. So it is bound to nucleus. It cannot come out of the control of the nucleus. So if you put n is equal to 1, you will get minus 13.6 electron volt. So here the energies will be very small. That's why all energies will be expressed in terms of electron volt. So 1 electron volt is energy gained by an electron when it is accelerated through a potential difference of 1 volt. Then in the case of nth orbit, so En will be equal to 13.6 by n square electron volt. So as you move away from the nucleus, the value of energy goes on decreasing, but due to negative sign, it actually increases. So energy of electron in the orbit increases with increase in the orbit number n. That means principal quantum number n. Now kinetic energy is given by E square divided by 8 pi epsilon naught r, that is me to the power 4 8 epsilon naught square n square h square. So total energy and kinetic energy will be equal, but kinetic energy is positive, total energy is negative. Potential energy is double the kinetic energy, that is double the total energy. That is what you will get. Next, expression for wave number. When electron makes transition from one energy level to another energy level, then the emitted wavelength is, if it is lambda, reciprocal of wavelength is called wave number. So that is given by r into 1 by n1 square minus 1 by n2 square. So n1 is the principal quantum number of the orbit from which to which the electron lands, and n2 is the starting point. So this is the principal quantum number of starting point, n1 is principal quantum number of end point. Here r is called Rydberg constant, its value is 1.097 into 10 to the power 7 per meter. Then if n1 is equal to 1 and n2 is 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., then you will get series of spectral lines. So that lies in UV region, that is what we call it as Lyman series. If n1 is equal to 2, final level is 2, and n2 is 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., then the series of spectrum that you get that lies in visible region, that is called Balmer series. Similarly, n1 is equal to 3, n2 is equal to 4, 5, 6, etc., lies in IR region, infrared region, so that is called Paschen series. And for n1 is equal to 4, you will get bracket series, and n1 is equal to 5, you will get Pfund series. So these two lie in far infrared region. So these are the spectral series of hydrogen atom. So whenever an electron is in nth excited state, then when it comes back to the ground state, number of possible transitions is given by n into n minus 1 divided by 2. For example, suppose if it is in the state of principal quantum number 4, then when it comes back to 1, what are the possible spectral number of spectral lines? It is given by 4 into 4 minus 1 divided by 2. So number of spectral lines it can emit is 4 into 3, 12, 12 divided by 2, that is 6. So it can emit 6 spectral lines. So in any series, maximum wavelength is called series limit, and minimum wavelength corresponds to n2 is equal to infinity. When n2 is equal to infinity, energy is maximum, wave number is maximum, but wavelength will be minimum. So maximum wavelength is called series limit and minimum wavelength corresponds to n2 is equal to infinity. Then first member of the series has maximum wavelength, that is n square h square epsilon naught divided by pi m. And whenever you send an electron from lower energy state to higher energy state, energy is absorbed. So that is called excitation energy. Excitation energy will be equal to difference in the energies of the two energy levels between which the transition is happening. Suppose if the electron in the ground state, that is E1, is sent to level infinity, that means it becomes free, then the process is called ionization, and the energy required to do this is called ionization energy. See, sending an electron from lower energy orbit to higher energy orbit is called excitation. Sending an electron from ground state to infinity, that means removing out of the atom, that is called ionization. Then some of the important relations for hydrogen like atoms is radius of nth orbit is n square h square epsilon naught divided by pi mz e square. Velocity in nth orbit is z square divided by 2nh epsilon naught. Energy in nth orbit is mz square e to the power 4 divided by 8 n square h square epsilon naught square. So these three relations are important. Then one more observation you can make out here. The time period of revolution of an electron is directly proportional to cube of the principal quantum number, and velocity is inversely proportional to principal quantum number, and radius of the orbit is directly proportional to principal quantum number, and area of the orbit is directly proportional to fourth power of principal quantum number. So these are some of the useful relations. Then wave number is 1 by lambda. For hydrogen like atom, it will be r z square, where z is atomic number, into 1 by n1 square minus 1 by n2 square, where r is your Rydberg constant. Then coming to demerits or drawbacks of Bohr's theory. So Bohr's theory could not explain the spectra of complex atoms having more than one electron. Even if you consider helium atom, it contains 2 electrons. So for such atom you cannot use Bohr's theory. That is the first demerit. Then this model could not explain the fine structure of spectral lines. So when you observe the spectral lines, so if you increase the resolving power of the spectrometer being used, then each spectral line, if you zoom into this, then it splits into several spectral lines. So each spectral line will have a finer structure. So that is called fine structure of spectral lines. Why there is splitting of lines, why there is fine structure, that could not be explained by Bohr's theory. Then this model could not explain the phenomena of splitting of spectral lines in presence of electric field and magnetic field. So when you apply electric field to the source which is emitting the spectrum, then the spectral lines split. So in the presence of electric field, if it splits, it is called Stark effect. In the presence of magnetic field, if it splits, it is called Zeeman effect. So Bohr's theory failed to explain Zeeman effect and Stark effect. Then this theory does not give any information regarding arrangement and distribution of electrons in the atom. How electrons are distributed in the atom, that could not be explained. So that is all about the chapter atoms. Thank you. Welcome to online CT class. So now we will discuss the synopsis of the chapter nuclei. So it was Rutherford whose experiments of alpha ray scattering proved that there is a positively charged nucleus at the center of the atom, where 99.9% of the mass of the atom is concentrated, and all the positive charge of the atom is concentrated on it. So Rutherford discovered the atomic nucleus. So following that, James Chadwick made a hypothesis of neutron. Later it was discovered. It was postulated that nucleus contains protons and neutrons. So protons and neutrons are inhabitants of the nucleus. So protons and neutrons put together, they are called nucleons. So this is the composition of the nucleus. So nucleus contains protons and neutrons. Protons contain the positive charge and neutrons are neutrally charged. So all the charge on the nucleus is due to the presence of protons, because neutron is neutrally charged, it does not carry any charge. Now nucleus contains protons and neutrons. So protons are positively charged while neutrons are electrically neutral. Mass of the proton is 1.6726 into 10 power minus 27 kg, whereas mass of the neutron is 1.6749 into 10 power minus 27 kg. So mass of neutron is slightly greater than that of proton. For rough calculations, we will take them to be equal, but strictly speaking, it is slightly greater. Then number of protons inside the nucleus is called atomic number. It is denoted by Z, and number of neutrons is given by A minus Z, where A is mass number of the atom. So mass number is total number of nucleons, that is protons and neutrons put together. So mass number minus atomic number will give you neutron number, number of neutrons in the nucleus. Then any atomic nucleus is represented by its chemical symbol. So if X is the chemical symbol for it, then we'll write Z at the lower part of the left side of the symbol, and on the right side at the upper part as a superscript will write the mass number. For example, if you consider uranium, so it should not be 96. So if you take uranium 92 to 36. So this is how we represent a nucleus, where this is mass number, this is atomic number. Difference of these two will give you neutron number. Moving further, nuclei with same number of protons, that is same atomic number, but with different mass number, they are termed as isotopes. For example, carbon 12, carbon 14, carbon 11. So all of them represent the same element because their atomic numbers are same, but mass numbers are different. That is due to difference in neutron number. Then nuclei having same mass number but different atomic number, they are called isobars. For example, oxygen 16, nitrogen 16. So nitrogen 14 is normal isotope. So nitrogen 16 is another isotope. So these two have same mass number but different atomic number. So chemically their properties are different. But here both of them are carbon only. So their chemical properties will be same. Then nuclei with same number of neutrons are called isotones. For example, nitrogen 14, so this contains 7 neutrons. Carbon 13, if you take, this also contains 7 neutrons. Or you can take helium He24 and isotope of hydrogen 1H3. So these two contain 2 neutrons each. Next, average radius R of the nucleus is given by R is equal to R naught into A to the power 1 by 3. This is the first property of the nucleus. The radius of the nucleus is given by R is equal to R naught A to the power 1 by 3, where R is a constant. It is 1.2 Fermi, 1.2 femtometer. 1 Fermi is 10 to the power minus 15 meter, and A is the mass number of the nucleus. So volume of a nucleus is directly proportional to the mass number. So volume is proportional to R cube. So R cube is proportional to A. So R is proportional to A to the power 1 by 3. So assuming the nucleus to be spherical from Rutherford's alpha scattering experiment and the other experiment data, so combining them they arrived at this formula. So this is the size of the nucleus. Then coming to charge of the nucleus. See, nucleus contains protons and neutrons are electrically neutral. So entire charge on the nucleus must be due to the number of protons present in it. So total charge on the nucleus should be equal to proton number into charge on each proton. And we know that charge on each proton is equal to that of electron charge, that is 1.6 into 10 power minus 19 coulomb, but the polarity of the charge is positive. So it will be Q is equal to plus Ze. That is the total charge on the nucleus. Then total mass of the nucleus is its nuclear mass. Now comparing with the previous case, total charge is the total charge of the net charge of the constituents. But if we consider the mass, so if you calculate the mass of the nucleus, that will be equal to Z times the mass of proton and A minus Z times mass of neutron. If you do this, you will get the mass of the constituents. But nuclear mass will be, the measured mass of the nucleus will be less than this. So if M is the measured mass of the nucleus, which will be less than Z times MP plus A minus Z times Mn. So there will be some mass missing. So that missing mass we call it as mass defect. So measured mass of the nucleus will be less than the calculated mass. So that missing mass we call it as mass defect. It is denoted by delta M. Then nuclear density. See, nucleus contains almost 99.9% the mass of the atom, but the size of the nucleus is very small. It is of the order of 10 power minus 15 meter. So if you calculate the density, density is of the order of 10 power 17 to 10 to the power 18 kg per meter cube, and you can prove that it is independent of mass number. That means all the nuclei, irrespective of how many nucleons are there, they have same density. So whether you take helium nucleus or you take uranium nucleus, all of them will have same density. Density is independent of mass number. Then the resultant angular momentum of the nucleus is called its nuclear spin. So it is resultant of the spin angular momentum and orbital angular momentum of all the protons and neutrons present in it. So that will give you net angular momentum. So nuclear magnetic moment is a resultant of magnetic moments of all the nucleons. It is related to spin of the nucleons. So we define a quantity called nuclear magneton, just like what we define it as Bohr magneton. So for electron, here it is for nucleon. So it will be nuclear magneton. It is EH by 4 pi mp, where mp is mass of the proton. So this turns out to be 5.05 into 10 to the power minus 27 joule per Tesla. This is called nuclear magneton. It is the magnetic moment associated with a proton. Next, nuclear masses will be very small, of the order of 10 power minus 27 kg. So in order to make it more convenient to deal with numbers and to get more accuracy, we define a unit called atomic mass unit. So one atomic mass unit is defined as 1/12 the mass of carbon 12 atom. So this is to be 1 AMU. We can prove that it is equal to 1.661 into 10 power minus 27 kg. Mass of proton is in terms of atomic mass unit. So now we don't use AMU, we call it as just U, unified mass unit. So should not write it as AMU, we should write it as U. So 1.0073 U for proton. For neutron it is 1.0087 U. Then for electron it is about 5.486 into 10 power minus 4 AMU. So it is so less compared to this. So mass of electron is about roughly 2000 times smaller than mass of a neutron or proton. So this is what is about atomic mass unit. Then coming to Einstein's mass energy relation. According to Einstein's famous equation E is equal to mc square, mass and energy are interconvertible. Mass can be converted to energy, energy can be converted to mass. So if mass m is converted completely to energy, you will get E amount of energy. E is given by mc square. Then we define a smaller unit of energy. Actually, joule is the SI unit of energy. So here we define a smaller unit called electron volt. So 1 electron volt is the energy gained by an electron when it is accelerated through potential difference of 1 volt, and you can prove that it is equal to 1.6 into 10 power minus 19 joule. So if it is too small to express the energies in the case of nuclear energy levels, then we use million electron volt or mega electron volt, that is 10 power 6 electron volt, that is nothing but 1.6 into 10 power minus 13 joule. Then energy equivalent to 1 atomic mass unit will be equal to 931 MeV, 931 million electron volt. That means 1 atomic mass unit of mass is completely converted to energy, then you will get 931 million electron volt of energy. Now coming to the concept of nuclear forces. So nuclear forces are the forces that hold the nucleons in a nucleus together. They must be strongest forces in nature, because if you consider two protons at a very close distance, the repulsion between them will be enormous. They will be throwing one another. But still, in spite of that repulsion, nucleons are held in their position, means it must be due to a force which is stronger than electrostatic force. So now coming to properties of nuclear forces. So nuclear forces are strongest in nature. They are short range forces. So they act up to about some 2.5 femtometer Fermi. That's all. Beyond this, nuclear forces are not seen. Then they are charge independent. So the force between two protons, the force between a proton and a neutron, and between two neutrons, if you consider nuclear force between any of these pairs, it will remain same. So they are charge independent. Then nuclear forces are spin dependent. So if two nucleons are staying one next to the other, then if this has the spin half, this should have the spin minus half. They will pair up. So need not be both are protons or both are neutrons. So one should be having half spin, other should be having minus half spin. So they are spin dependent. Then they are exchange forces. So during the interaction, the nucleons exchange a particle called pi meson. Then nuclear forces are non-central forces. That means if you consider gravitational force or electrostatic force, the two particles, the force between them acts along the line joining the two particles. But here it is not so. So that's why they are called non-central forces. And they show the property of saturation. That means one nucleon will interact with only a limited number of other nucleons. So all the nucleons will not be contacted or communicated by one nucleon. So they reach saturation. There is a finite number of nucleons with which a nucleon can interact. So these are the properties of nuclear forces. Now coming to the concept of mass defect, as I told you, the calculated mass will be greater than the measured mass. If measured mass of the nucleus is Ma and this is calculated mass, the difference in those two, we call it as mass defect. Then the missing mass, what happens to that? That gets converted to energy, and that will be utilized to hold the nucleons together. So that energy we call it as binding energy. So binding energy of a nucleus is defined as the energy required to break the nucleus into its constituent particles so that there is no interaction between them. That means you should break the nucleus and the nucleon should be taken to infinite distance apart. For that, how much energy is needed? That is called binding energy. So binding energy of nucleus is mass defect into C square in joule. When delta M is in kg, then you will get the answer in joule. Suppose if delta M is in atomic mass unit. Then you should take delta m into 931. You will get the answer in MeV, million electron volt. So this is your binding energy. So now if there are a number of nucleons in a nucleus, then binding energy divided by a. It is called binding energy per nucleon or specific binding energy. Both are one and the same. Now coming to binding energy curve. So if you consider the different nuclei, they will have different specific binding energies. So what they did is they plotted the graph of the smallest possible nucleus, that is deuterium, till the largest nucleus, that is uranium, and against their specific binding energies, binding energy per nucleon. When you plot this, you get this kind of a curve. It's a scattered graph. So you can find there are some peaks and there are valleys, and beyond this it is almost constant, then it slowly decreases. So this graph we call it as binding energy curve. So this is called binding energy curve. So in order to understand the behavior of the nucleus, this binding energy curve plays a very important role. Now what conclusions you can draw from binding energy curve? So nuclear force is attractive. It is sufficiently strong to produce few MeV of binding energy per nucleon. Few MeV of binding energy per nucleon. Notice one thing, this is in MeV and it is specific binding energy, that is binding energy per nucleon. So somewhere here it is 8 MeV, here it is 6 MeV, here it is 4 MeV, and so on. So larger the EBN means binding energy per nucleon, that is specific binding energy, greater is the stability of the nucleus. They are bound with more energy, you have to supply more energy to break it. In the case of light nuclei, the nuclei lying around maxima are relatively more stable than the other nuclei in the neighborhood. For example, here you can see the peak. So suddenly there is peak, then there is depression. So helium is slightly more stable than its neighborhood, that means tritium and lithium. Here again we get for carbon, oxygen, sulfur. So these are relatively more stable than their their nearest neighbors. Now generally light nuclei and heavy nuclei have low average binding energy and hence they are relatively less stable. Two light nucleus or two heavy nuclei, if you consider, they have low average binding energy. So lower the binding energy, stability is less. Then so between atomic mass number 40 to 120, the specific binding energy is almost constant. You can observe from the graph, somewhere here till here it is almost constant. So it is from somewhere from 40 to 120. So in this region it is almost constant, close to 8.5 MeV. So this means the elements lying in this, that is middle mass nuclei, they are more stable than other nuclei. Then when two light nuclei fuse to form a middle mass nuclei. So light nuclei have lesser binding energy. When they form middle mass nucleus has greater binding energy. So what does it give you? It will give you a more stable product. So that means greater binding energy of the product means it has attained more stability. Stability is attained by releasing the energy. So this process where two light nuclei combining to form a heavy nucleus giving out energy, we call it as nuclear fusion. So binding energy curve gives you the idea of nuclear fusion. Then on the other hand, if you consider a heavy nucleus, if a heavy nucleus is split into two lighter ones which are lying in the middle mass area, there again the products will have greater binding energy. That means product are more stable, and stability is again achieved by releasing the energy. Energy is again released. So this phenomena we call it as nuclear fission. So heavy nucleus splitting into lighter nuclei forms nuclear fission, and lighter nuclei fusing to form heavier nucleus, it is called nuclear fusion. In both the cases energy is released. So this idea can be used for commercial energy production. Now coming to nuclear fission. So it was Otto Hahn and Strassmann, they discovered the phenomena of nuclear fission. So nuclear fission is a process in which a heavy nucleus splits into two lighter nuclei of comparable masses, that is middle mass nuclei, releasing 2 or 3 neutrons and energy. So a typical nuclear reaction is like this: uranium 235 plus neutron giving rise to uranium 236. So this is intermediate. Then that gives rise to xenon plus strontium plus 2 neutrons plus energy. This is one example of the reaction. So notice one thing, these two are middle mass nuclei, they have greater binding energy. So some energy is released in this process. Now the energy released, along with that there are neutrons. So in order to carry out this fission, we need a neutron bombarded with nucleus. Now these two neutrons, they are capable of producing some more fission. So these two neutrons will strike other nuclei, and again the one more fission process take place. So such a reaction we call it as chain reaction. So chain reaction is a process in which number of neutrons produced in fission goes on multiplying until all the material undergoes fission. So that is what we call it as chain reaction. Now this chain reaction has to be controlled, otherwise it will lead to explosion. That's what happens in a atomic bomb. Now in order to have controlled chain reaction, we need to supply the fissionable material in a particular size. So the size should be appropriate, so that if it is too small, chain reaction may not sustain. If it is too large, it may lead to explosion. So it should be chosen very carefully, the size of the fissionable material that is taken such that chain reaction takes place in a constant rate. That is what we call it as critical size, and the corresponding mass is called critical mass. Then coming to nuclear reactor. Nuclear reactor is a arrangement where self-sustained chain reaction can take place. A controlled self-sustained chain reaction can take place. So main parts of the nuclear reactor are nuclear fuel, moderator, control rods, neutron reflector, cooling system, and safety system. So nuclear fuel is the fissionable material, generally uranium or thorium, which is taken in the form of pellets, and then those pellets are made in terms of in the form of rods. So they will be inserted into the reactor core. Then there is moderator. It is a material which is used to slow down neutrons. So it should have low atomic mass and it should not absorb neutrons. So generally a proton rich species are used, so that due to collision of neutrons with these protons, their energies are reduced. So generally graphite, heavy water, and beryllium are used as moderators. Then coming to control rods. So in order to carry out the controlled chain reaction, the number of neutrons, the neutron population should be under control, so that it should just cause chain reaction. That means one fission should lead to only one more fission. If it causes 2, then neutron number increases exponentially. It will cause explosive reaction. So in order to keep it in control, we need to remove the extra neutrons which are capable of causing extra fissions. So for that, neutron absorbing material will be used. So they are called control rods. So generally cadmium or boron rods are used as control rods. They are good for absorbing neutrons. Then coming to nuclear fusion. So nuclear fusion is a process in which two light nuclei combine to form a heavier nucleus. with the release of energy. So typical fusion reaction can be represented like this. Two deuterium nuclei combining to form a helium plus neutron plus energy. So this releases energy. When uranium undergoes fission, it releases about 200 MeV of energy per fission, but here you will get around some 24 MeV per fusion. But if you take per unit reaction, energy released is more in fission, but if you take per unit mass of the material, in nuclear fusion only energy released is more. So nuclear fusion takes place only at very high temperature. So they are thermonuclear reactions. So right now they are taking place in stars. So energy production mechanism in stars is due to thermonuclear fusion reactions. So that's all about the properties of nucleus. Now moving on to the next phenomena, that is radioactivity. So radioactivity is a phenomena in which a heavy nucleus spontaneously disintegrates with the emission of certain radiations like alpha, beta and gamma rays. So this phenomena is unaffected by external conditions like temperature, pressure, electric field and all. So if you want, even if you want, you cannot accelerate the process. Even if you don't want, you cannot curb the process. So it's completely not in our control. So it's a spontaneous process which happens on its own. So this kind of process we call it as natural radioactivity. It was first discovered by Becquerel. Then Marie Curie and Pierre Curie, they discovered two radioactive elements, namely polonium and radium. So they not only discovered them, they extracted them also. So these radioactive nuclei generally emit three types of radiation: alpha, beta and gamma rays. So they are called collectively, they are radioactive rays, they are called Becquerel rays. So all of them affect photographic plate and produce fluorescence in certain substances. Now let us see the properties of alpha, beta and gamma rays one by one. So alpha rays, if you consider, so they are positively charged particle, relatively heavier than the other two particles. So chemically they are, alpha particle is a helium nucleus. So it contains 2 protons and 2 neutrons. So it has 2e amount of charge, 2 units of charge or 4 units of mass. So mass number is 4 and the atomic number is 2 for alpha particle. So since they have positive charge, they get deflected by electric and magnetic field. So their velocity is of the order of 1 by 20 at the time the speed of light. Then they have very high ionizing power. So they ionize the gases through which they pass. Their ionizing power is about 100 times that of beta rays and 10,000 times that of gamma rays. They are scattered by nuclei of heavy elements and they produce heating effect, and they have very less penetrating power. So they can be stopped by 0.006 centimeter thick aluminum sheet. So an aluminum foil or a thin paper can stop the alpha particles. They have very least penetrative power. Now coming to beta rays. So beta rays are identified as electrons. So obviously they are negatively charged. They are deflected by electric and magnetic fields. So they travel at the speeds close to speed of light, 0.3 times the speed of light to 0.99 times the speed of light, depending on the source. Their ionizing power is 1/100th of alpha rays and about 100 times more than that of gamma rays. They are better than gamma rays but not better than alpha rays. Then their penetrative power is larger than that of alpha rays. They can penetrate through thin metal foils also. Then beta particle is emitted by nucleus of a radioactive substance. An electron does not exist inside a nucleus. It is formed at the instant of emission. So we know that electron does not exist inside nucleus, but during beta decay it comes out of the nucleus. So it is due to the conversion of a neutron into a proton and electron. So along with that, an antineutrino will be emitted. Coming to gamma rays, they are electromagnetic waves of wavelength 0.1 angstrom to 0.01 angstrom. So they don't have any mass, they are photons. They travel with the speed of light. So they are uncharged, they are not deflected by electric and magnetic field. Then they ionize the gases through which they pass. Their ionization power is 100th that of beta rays and 1 by 10,000 of the alpha rays. So they have least ionizing power among all the three radiations. Then gamma rays are more penetrative than beta and alpha rays. They can pass through an iron plate which is 30 centimeter thick. So it can even pass through iron also. So they destroy living tissues. They produce photoelectric effect and Compton effect in some materials. So these are the properties of gamma rays. Now coming to beta decay. So here we have neutrinos hypothesis. This was put forwarded by Pauli. So it is called Pauli's neutrino hypothesis. So all beta rays emitted from a given radioactive nucleus do not have the same energy. So in order to explain this, Pauli proposed that together with an electron, another particle called neutrino was emitted. So initially, before the neutrino was proposed, so there were discrepancies with respect to beta decay in conservation of energy and angular momentum. So both basic laws were being violated. So in order to conserve that, Pauli hypothesized that he proposed that neutrino is also emitted along with the beta particle, so that it can carry the missing energy and missing angular momentum. So the reaction can be taken this way: a neutron getting converted to proton giving rise to electron plus anti-neutrino. So nu bar represents anti-neutrino, nu represents neutrino. So when negative beta particle comes out, we get anti-neutrino. But when you get positive beta particle, then it is called positive beta decay. So during that, neutrino is emitted. So neutrino is emitted during positive beta decay. It is also called as positron decay. So remember one thing, electron is negatively charged, antiparticle of electron is positron. So it has same mass as that of electron but opposite charge. Moving further, coming to radioactivity. So whenever you consider a radioactive substance or radioactive nucleus, so it undergoes continuous disintegration with the emission of alpha or beta rays. Along with that, sometimes gamma rays are also emitted. So a given nucleus will either emit alpha particle or beta particle, not both. So if I take a sample, radioactive sample at any instant, then the rate of its disintegration is directly proportional to number of radioactive nuclei present in that sample at that instant. So this is what we call it as decay law. So it is law of radioactive disintegration, or it is also called as decay law. So according to decay law, rate of disintegration is dN by dt is proportional to n, where n is instantaneous number of atoms present in that sample. So dN by dt, you can introduce proportionality constant lambda and negative sign because n goes on decreasing with increase in time. So I can call it as minus lambda into n. Lambda is called constant of proportionality. It is also called as decay constant or disintegration constant. So proceeding with the mathematics of this, by integrating this, we will get n is equal to n naught e to the power minus lambda t. So the number of radioactive atoms in a sample goes on decreasing exponentially with respect to time. Then when t is equal to 1 by lambda, then n is equal to 1 by e times n naught. So 1 by e is nothing but 0.69369. So it is 0.37 times n naught. Now using this you can define decay constant of a radioactive substance. It is reciprocal of the time after which the number of nuclei in the sample reduces to 1 by e times, where e is exponential constant, 1 by e times the initial number of atoms taken. Then coming to next concept, that is activity of a radioactive sample. It is nothing but rate of disintegration. dN by dt is activity. So dN by dt can be taken as lambda into n from the decay law. So from that you can also conclude that A is equal to A naught minus lambda t, where A is instantaneous activity, A naught is activity at t is equal to 0. Now activity is rate of disintegration. Rate of disintegration is measured in these three common units. So SI unit of activity is becquerel, is denoted by BQ. 1 becquerel is 1 disintegration per second, whereas another unit is 1 Curie. 1 Curie is 3.7 into 10 power 10 disintegrations per second. 1 Rutherford is 10 power 6 disintegrations per second. So these are the commonly used units in radioactivity. Now the next concept is half-life of a radioactive sample. So since the decay is exponential, the number never becomes 0. So the curve never touches the x-axis. So instead of defining the full lifetime of sample, which will be infinite, we will define half-life of the sample. Half-life of a radioactive sample is the time taken for half of the number of radioactive nuclei to disintegrate. That means the number of radioactive nuclei in the sample should get reduced to half. For that, how much time it takes? That is called half-life of the sample. So you can prove that half-life is equal to 0.693 by lambda. The lambda is decay constant. Notice one thing, decay constant varies from one substance to other substance, one sample to other sample. Hence, half-life also varies from one sample to another sample. So after n half-lives, the number of nuclei remaining will be n naught divided by 2 to the power n. So these many will be remaining. Then in terms of mass, if you express decay law, it will be mt is equal to m naught e to the power minus lambda t. So in addition to half-life, we will define the mean life of the sample. It is the ratio of total lifetime of all the individual nuclei to the total number of nuclei present in the sample. It can be proved that mean life tau is equal to 1 by lambda. So t half, the half-life is 0.693 by lambda. You can write that as 0.693 tau. This is the relation between half-life and mean life. So that is all about your radioactivity and nuclei. Thank you.